Hi, everybody. As you know, last week, week one of this course in 660, I gave you some notes on the Kettl text. This week, I thought I'd try something different and give you just a short little lecture. This shouldn't take more than 10 minutes, but I wanted to talk about some of the things Kettl talked about in chapter 2 when he discusses administrative traditions. So let's get right into that. Okay, so, you know, this actually might be one of the most important chapters that you can read during this term and the program. I think it's a really great chapter. And so why did I say that? What the heck am I talking about? Um, well, first of all, these four traditions that Kettl identifies as Jeffersonian, the Jeffersonian tradition, the Hamiltonian tradition, the Madisonian tradition, and the Wilsonian tradition are really widely recognized in the public administration literature. They drive the way we view the role of government and administration, and they often seem in conflict and in concert. So what I'm saying by that is we can often see examples of them at work simultaneously in governments at all levels. And finally, really, it's important to know this stuff. Yes, you can impress people at parties if you refer to, the Hamiltonian tradition or the Madisonian tradition. Um, so it's good for that. But so what are these traditions that are in conflict? So roughly Jeffersonian refers to this idea of a decentralized state-centered kind of government. The Hamiltonian tradition is more centralized, but not necessarily unitary, and definitely a stronger executive. The Madisonian tradition is really concerned with setting off interests against interests, and the Wilsonian tradition is concerned with the need for an administrative structure to actually run the Constitution, as he said in 1887. Um, so, you know, in Kettl chapter 2, on page 26, you see a couple of these quotes, and these are really important for you as a person who is interested in public administration. First of all, Kettl defines public administration as the art of turning big ideas, big policy ideas into solid results. And that's really interesting. And he says that it ranks among the very oldest of intellectual disciplines. He talks about a book by Wildavsky in chapter 2. But you can go back and think about the history of administration. I mean, people have been uh, doing government policy and then uh, implementing that policy for thousands of years. Um, if you fly over, if you happen to be lucky enough to fly over the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in Iraq, as I have done, you can actually look down in the sand and you can see the scar marks from more recent and even ancient irrigation systems. And really, irrigation was invented there in that area of the world, but it was a big idea. That big idea was, hey, what if we routed this river water onto this dry soil to grow crops and engage in agriculture? That was a huge idea several thousand years ago, you know, but it took people to organize that idea and turn it into solid results. So administration is very old. And then second, Kettl says administration is about organizing people to do complex jobs. Public administration is about organizing people to do these complex jobs in pursuit of a broader government defined interest. But as we know, governance is rife with conflicts, right? So people have a desire to be left alone, and that uh, is set up against a desire for the government to do something about some problem. We have a desire to pay less in taxes versus a demand for more government services. There's a desire to run government like a business versus a desire for representation, right? Um, in government. There's a desire for privacy versus a desire for government to spy on bad people, on terrorists and criminals. So there are these conflicts every day and continually when we talk about governance. And so what are these traditions? Well, Hamilton was a leading voice for a stronger constitution. He was one of the people who led the charge for a convention, really, that ended up writing the Constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation. He wanted to know, really, how could we make the national government stronger, strong enough to be effective, and how could we make an executive powerful enough for the government to be strong? I mean, he famously called for, at the Constitutional Convention early on, a kind of a constitutional monarchy. That idea was quickly dismissed. He shoved it aside, but he was still a believer in a strong executive. But he said that a strong executive has to have independence, power, and responsibility. And you can read this in Federalist number 70. And by the way, if you haven't ever read the Federalist Papers, I would encourage you to do so. But he said there must be energy in the executive, and that the executive must be skilled. And he said further that there must be unity in the executive. So in other words, there should be an executive to run these programs that the legislative branch creates. But finally, the executive must be accountable. And so he did believe in the idea that the legislative branch should be able to impeach the executive, for example. But he was also focused early on in government, in Washington's administration, in creating a strong government. And he argued for something called the First Bank of the United States, which did come into existence. And so what's his legacy? Well, really, Hamilton's legacy is that over about 200 years, the power of the executive has grown, and we know that. And that's not just at the national level with the president, but the power of many governors has grown. The power of many mayors has grown. And in terms of Hamilton's view of business and government and that relationship, we know that government has taken on the role, and it's ebbed and flowed, but the role of really promoter of U.S. business. And so we have some really great examples of that throughout history, and not just recently, but throughout history. So, for example, the Transcontinental Railroad would not have happened in the 1860s had the federal government not backed the debt of the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad. And so that is part of Hamilton's legacy. What's this Jeffersonian tradition? Well, we all know Jefferson is the author of the Declaration of Independence, but Jefferson had almost this mythical belief in the power of an agrarian republic. He believed that government was best when it was done locally, and he was a firm supporter of the 10th Amendment that devolved power to the states. But interestingly enough, his presidency was seemingly marked with more Hamiltonian administration. Jefferson engaged in the Louisiana Purchase with France really without any kind of notification or advice or consent from the Congress. And so that's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. But Jefferson's legacy, of course, continues, not just the Declaration of Independence, but this continuing debate on the power of the national government versus state governments. And we continue this to this day, and that argument will go on, I predict, but because it is part of his legacy. And then there's this idea of the Hamiltonian or the Madisonian tradition. The Madisonian tradition really is more really a theory of politics, because what Madison recognized in writing the Constitution was that there were ambitious people. And so the idea of separation of powers is really his contribution, that ambitious people in the executive will counteract ambitious people in the legislative, that the courts will counteract them both, that states will counteract the national government. And he further went on to recognize that there are various interests that want something from government, or maybe wants government not to do something. And so the legacy that we have from Madison is that we do recognize people vote. We all vote. I hope you vote. But we also recognize that various interests have something to say as well. And so we have this idea of interest group liberalism that asserts that interests counteract other interests. Well, I mean, a lot of people claim that doesn't work in practice, that some interests are a lot stronger than others. But again, this is part of the Madisonian tradition. And so, what do we mean by the Wilsonian tradition? Well, of course, of these four people, um, Wilson is the one who is not the founding father, but Wilson did write a very famous article in 1887 that we still refer to in public administration. But he famously said that it's harder to run a constitution than to form one. So what did he mean by that? He meant that the United States, in his words, had grown up like a child, that it was kind of it was getting bigger, but it was sort of clumsy and ungainly. And when when Wilson said that we have to separate politics from administration, what he really meant was that in his view, there needed to be a professional cadre of administrators who carried out the laws and the policies that the politicians had put into place. And so his legacy is that this view that administrators can separate themselves from politics, I mean, whatever we mean by that term, and whether or not that's realistic, and that part of his legacy also is that people continue to make a distinction between elected officials and appointed officials. I mean, they often refer to appointed officials as bureaucrats, and they don't necessarily mean that in the nicest way. And so, what happens when these four ideas sort of try to crash into each other? So, on the left-hand side of this table, and this is from the Kettl book on page 44, we see the Hamiltonian tradition of a strong executive and the Jeffersonian tradition of a weak executive kind of lined up against Wilsonian bureaucracy-centered government and Madisonian balance of power-centered government. So, uh, you know, when a strong executive meets up with the Wilsonian tradition, what we have is we have a government kind of centered on the executive. And again, I'm not just talking about the national government. We could be talking about state government or local government. And so the principle is that there's this strong executive function with top-down accountability and hierarchical authority. Well, what happens when that Hamiltonian tradition meets up with the Madisonian tradition? Well, instead of being centered on the executive, we're centered on non-bureaucratic institutions. Um, and so, interests, how do they play with our governmental institutions? And we have this principle of separation of powers with a focus on power. So it's power struggling against power, but there's still kind of a top-down accountability, right? Well, what happens if we have kind of a weak executive? Um, we find in the Wilsonian tradition that it's centered on local control, um, and executive power is devolved power. And there's bottom-up accountability and responsiveness to citizens. And so think of a local government, especially one without a mayor, with a council that ends up electing its mayor, and the mayor is more or less uh, the president of the council. So that's kind of a weak executive model, but that model actually does apply in a lot of, especially small towns in America, where the council, the board, runs the government, and they have a few hired people that do their bidding. But this model does actually exist in many local governments. But what about when it's meets up with Madisonianism? The key thing is that the, that the principle of federalism continues to apply. And so you can see that these ideas really do counteract each other and actually have to try to work together in many instances. So this chart is not from your reading at all, but it's a really interesting one, and you could probably put this on pause and kind of look at this, but this is from a reading by Stillman. But what he's talking about here is there's several topics that he talks about here. I'm going to use my cursor here. And then each of these traditions. So, you know, what happens if what are we talking about with the Hamiltonian tradition, the Jeffersonian, Madison, and Wilson? So the goal of the Hamiltonian tradition is a strong, sustained, focused organization with a lot of ability to promote national interests. The goal of the Jeffersonian model is strict public accountability to maximize personal liberty. The goal of Madison model is organic balancing of interest or factions, which was a word that Madison used in Federalist Number 10. And then Wilson focuses on the efficient implementation of policies devised by elected officials. Okay, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but you can put this on pause and you can use this as you go through the reading by Kettl this week. So the last thing I want to throw out there for you is, so how do we organize to implement policy? And that's what we're doing as administrators. We're implementing policy. I mean, because we have this struggle between legitimacy and accountability. And I came up with this chart a couple years ago for another class, but this is kind of how I view this, how administration and politics, if you will, work together. You know, how we might run a constitution. Legitimacy goes this way from the top down, and accountability goes up on the right-hand side. So legitimacy, we say the people are sovereign by natural law, and then the people form constitutions, and these constitutions legitimize the formation of government through elections, and then elected officials, legitimized by the Constitution, make policy. Then administrators carry out policy in a neutral manner. Now, I say that as a nod to Wilson. It doesn't always happen in a neutral manner, nor should it necessarily. And then administrators are organized in some rational manner, and the best model, to use might be business, or it might be something else, where rational decision making is the rule. And then accountability goes back towards the people. Now, first of all, there's some problems with this, and one is that that bottom bullet I put is that the best model is business. That would be the Wilsonian thought, and not everybody really believes that Wilson was necessarily correct about that. The best model might not be business, as a matter of fact. But the point is that we can derive legitimacy and accountability at the same time in administration. And it's somewhat incorrect when people say, bureaucrats are unaccountable. They're not unaccountable. They actually derive their power in a constitutional way, the same as elected people. So kind of look at this, look at it with a grain of salt, criticize it if you want, and say, yeah, he doesn't know what he's talking about, but that's fine. Take it as sort of an idea to use as you do the readings in Kettl this week and the rest of the term. Thanks very much.